Jebel Irhoud of Morocco is cited as evidence that modern humans evolved in Africa, but is this fossil really African? Many scholars argue that Jebel Irhoud must be treated as part of a nearly 1 million-year-old Mediterranean lineage, rather than African in the tropical sense. Indeed, French paleoanthropologist Jean-Jacques Hublin, who has worked extensively with Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, could hardly hide his contempt when speaking about the out of East Africa theory, while stopping short of declaring the theory a farce.
And so with these discoveries emerged the notion that there was in the past somewhere, maybe in East Africa, a sort of restricted Garden of Eden, where in a sort of biblical way, suddenly, around 200,000 years ago, a fully human creature, like us, emerged and then later expanded. And this view that prevailed for a long time has been challenged by many discoveries these past few years.
The Sahara was a barrier, not a corridor, while the Mediterranean repeatedly narrowed into a manageable ecological crossing. Long before genetics entered the discussion, this evidence already pointed north. In this framework, Jebel Irhoud represents neither an African origin point nor a European offshoot, but a Mediterranean population that had been evolving in situ since the early Pleistocene. The reason this possibility remains uncomfortable is not that the data reject it, but that it collapses the false opposition between African and European origins and exposes modern human emergence as a Mediterranean process that long predates any out-of-Africa narrative. Any theory that is dependent on a hard boundary between Africa and Eurasia is inherently flawed. The out-of-Africa story has insisted that Homo sapiens arose deep in sub-Saharan Africa and only later acquired the anatomical features we recognize as modern. Facial flatness, reduced prognathism, and gracility were framed as late evolutionary achievements, while anything that looked modern outside Africa was treated as anomalous, convergent, or misdated. Yet when facial morphology is examined honestly, and when it is placed alongside the archaeological record of tools rather than isolated from it, this story begins to unravel. What emerges instead is a far older and far more coherent picture. The so-called modern human face is not a recent African invention, but an ancient Mediterranean inheritance, one that appears early in Europe and North Africa, persists with remarkable stability, and is paired with a continuous technological tradition linking Iberia, southern France, Italy, and the Maghreb. Taken together, facial morphology and tools point not south of the Sahara, but west of the Levant, toward a Western Mediterranean origin for Homo sapiens. At the center of this re-evaluation stands a deceptively simple observation, articulated most clearly by Chris Stringer in 2022. Our so-called modern face is an ancient face. The Neanderthal face might actually be far more evolved. This statement is quietly revolutionary. It overturns the implicit ladder thinking that has long dominated paleoanthropology, in which modern humans are assumed to possess uniquely derived facial traits, while Neanderthals and other archaic humans are framed as primitive holdovers. Instead, the remark forces us to ask a more uncomfortable question. What if the flat, orthognathic face that defines modern humans is not derived at all, but ancestral? And what if the highly specialized Neanderthal face, with its inflated mid-face, projecting nasal complex, and reorganized sinuses, represents a later, regional experiment rather than a baseline condition? Stringer has repeatedly acknowledged in talks and interviews discussing early Homo sapiens that the ancestral sapiens face would have been relatively flat and retracted, explicitly noting that this condition is already visible in Homo antecessor. That statement is devastating to out of Africa if you follow it to its logical conclusion. Once this possibility is entertained, the fossil record begins to look very different. The earliest clearly preserved example of a modern facial configuration does not come from East Africa, but from southwestern Europe. Homo antecessor, dated to roughly 850,000 years ago, displays a face that would not look out of place on a much later Homo sapiens. The mid-face is relatively flat, the nasal aperture modest, and the overall profile strikingly orthognathic. This is not a transitional or ambiguous condition. It is a face that already falls squarely within the modern human range, long before any African fossil exhibits comparable morphology. Importantly, this facial anatomy is not accompanied by a large brain or other advanced traits traditionally associated with modern humans, demonstrating that facial modernity did not evolve as a package with encephalization. The face came first. This point is critical because it breaks the assumed evolutionary sequence. If facial modernity precedes brain globularity and appears outside Africa, then it cannot be dismissed as a late African innovation. Instead, it suggests deep roots in a Eurasian population that predates the split between Neanderthals and modern humans. Stringer himself has acknowledged this implication by proposing the existence of an inferred ancestor, often referred to as Ancestor X, possessing a mosaic anatomy. When Stringer acknowledges that the ancestral Homo sapiens face was flat and retracted, like that seen in European Middle Pleistocene fossils such as Homo antecessor, he concedes the core point while refusing the conclusion: the defining facial architecture of sapiens did not originate uniquely in late African fossils. That morphology already existed in the Mediterranean hundreds of thousands of years before Jebel Irhoud. Once this is admitted, Irhoud no longer represents a sudden African emergence, but the continuation of an older Mediterranean population trend. You cannot claim the sapiens' face looks like antecessor and simultaneously insist antecessor is evolutionarily irrelevant. One statement nullifies the other, and the geography collapses with it. In Stringer's own reconstruction, this ancestor combined a face like Homo antecessor, teeth trending toward Neanderthal robustness, and a brain case resembling a primitive Homo heidelbergensis, exemplified by the cranium from Ceprano, Italy. No single fossil yet preserves all these features together, but the individual components exist in Western and Southern Europe, not in sub-Saharan Africa. The persistence of this ancient facial form becomes even clearer when the record is extended into North Africa. The hominins from Jebel Irhoud, dated to around 300,000 years ago, possess faces that are unmistakably modern in configuration. Flat mid-faces, reduced prognathism, and overall proportions align them closely with later Homo sapiens. What distinguishes Irhoud from later humans is not the face, but the elongated, archaic brain case. This combination directly mirrors Stringer's own model, a modern face attached to a more primitive cranial vault. Crucially, Jebel Irhoud is geographically positioned not as an isolated African cradle, but as part of a Mediterranean continuum linking the Maghreb to Iberia via short sea crossings and repeated land bridges during periods of low sea level. Jebel Irhoud's North African location has encouraged interpretive gymnastics designed to keep it within an African-centric narrative. Yet anatomically, Irhoud looks like antecessor carried forward in time, a fact that ties North African origins back to Iberia rather than south of the Sahara. Facial morphology alone, however, is not sufficient to argue for a Mediterranean origin. Anatomy must be paired with behavior, and behavior is best traced through tools. Here again, the Mediterranean tells a story of continuity that is difficult to reconcile with a late sub-Saharan origin. The Apulian tradition appears early and robust in Iberia, southern France and Italy, with local innovations emerging over hundreds of thousands of years. By the Middle Pleistocene, this region exhibits a dense and continuous archaeological record, one that does not suggest repeated population replacement from Africa, but long-term local development. In North Africa, the Aterian industry emerges as a distinctive technological tradition characterized by tanged tools, hafting, and regional stylistic coherence. Crucially, multiple studies have shown that Aterian technology is more closely linked to Iberian and Mediterranean industries than to sub-Saharan African ones. This is not a trivial observation. Tools encode cultural transmission. If North African populations were derived from sub-Saharans, we would expect technological affinities to point southward. Instead, they point north and west, across the Mediterranean. Atlantic Morocco behaves like the Mediterranean world, not like tropical Africa. The Acheulean of Atlantic Morocco shows large, symmetrical bifaces, careful shaping and thinning, standardization comparable to Iberia, southern France and Italy. By contrast, many sub-Saharan early Stone Age industries retain more core and flake dominance, show different reduction strategies, lack the same long Acheulean continuity. Moroccan Acheulean looks European Mediterranean in structure, not equatorial. Moroccan lower Paleolithic sites are full of elephants, hippos, large bovids, and temperate Mediterranean species. These faunal packages track Iberia and southern Europe, not tropical Africa. Humans follow ecosystems, and Jebel Irhoud's world was Mediterranean, not equatorial. The Aterian does not appear as an intrusive package suddenly arriving from elsewhere. It develops locally, drawing on earlier Middle Stone Age and Acheulean foundations present in North Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. Its distribution mirrors the same Mediterranean arc, traced by facial morphology, from Morocco through the Maghreb and into the Levantine corridor. This technological continuity aligns precisely with the anatomical continuity seen from Antecessor through Irhoud to the Levant. When facial morphology and tools are considered together, the logic becomes difficult to escape. Ancestral populations with modern faces were already present in Western Europe by the early Pleistocene. These populations spread southward into North Africa, not as a one-time migration, but as part of a long-standing Mediterranean interaction zone. Over time, they developed regionally distinct tool traditions, such as the Aterian, while retaining a stable facial form. Meanwhile, other branches of the same ancestral population moved east and north, eventually giving rise to Neanderthals, who evolved increasingly specialized craniofacial traits under different ecological pressures. Rather than representing the cradle of modern humanity, sub-Saharan Africa appears as a refugium, where multiple lineages persisted, mixed and survived climatic fluctuations that extinguished counterparts elsewhere. This is not evidence against Africa's importance, but it does argue against its exclusivity as the source of modern humans. A Mediterranean origin also resolves long-standing contradictions in the genetic and fossil records. It explains why early European and Levantine fossils can look strikingly modern without being intrusive Africans. It explains why Neanderthals, genetically close to modern humans, nevertheless possess highly derived facial anatomy. It explains why North African industries show stronger ties to Iberia than to sub-Saharan Africa. And it aligns with Stringer's admission that the face of early Homo sapiens resembles Homo antecessor more than any African fossile. In fact, Stringer is no stranger to the Jebel Irhoud fossil, having studied it way back in the 1970s and coming to the conclusion that it could represent an ancestor of modern man as was closely related to the school Kafsa humans. But curiously, he never mentioned Jebel Irhoud for 3 decades until Hublin brought it back into the spotlight in 2017. The same facial pattern continues into the Levant and Europe between 200,000 and 100,000 years ago. The Skul and Kafsa humans of the Levant display near fully modern faces attached to still somewhat archaic cranial shapes, again reinforcing the idea that facial modernity is ancient and stable. The face that once looked anomalously modern in Antecessor has simply persisted, while other populations, such as Neanderthals, diverged away from it. This raises a profound evolutionary implication. If Neanderthals evolved their distinctive facial anatomy after diverging from a shared ancestor with modern humans, then the Neanderthal face is not primitive but derived. Its enlarged nasal region, mid-facial prognathism and sinus reorganization reflect adaptation to cold, dry environments and high energetic demands, not retention of an ancestral condition. In this light, the modern human face is not a marker of advancement, but of conservatism. It is the survival of an ancient Western Eurasian template. The tragedy of the traditional out-of-Africa theory is not that it emphasized Africa, but that it flattened Africa into a catchphrase while ignoring the Mediterranean as a dynamic, interconnected zone. Once the Mediterranean is restored to its rightful place, Homo sapiens no longer appears as a sudden African apparition. Instead, our species emerges gradually from an ancient Mediterranean population, carrying with it a face that had already endured for hundreds of thousands of years. Jebel Irhoud does not require a sub-Saharan African origin to exist. Its face, cranial architecture, and archaeological context make far more sense as the Western expression of a long-standing Mediterranean hominin metapopulation that linked Iberia, southern Europe and North Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. The Acheulean industries of Atlantic Morocco are explicitly compared by French archaeologists to those of Iberia and the Mediterranean, not to sub-Saharan Africa, because they share the same technological grammar, ecological setting, and stratigraphic depth. Perhaps most tellingly, this model requires no special pleading. It does not rely on missing migrations, sudden leaps, or isolated failed dispersals. It follows the evidence where it leads. Faces appear early in the West. Tools evolve continuously in the West. Later humans inherit both. In that sense, Stringer's remark is more than a provocative quote. It is a quiet confession embedded in the data. Our face is ancient, Neanderthal faces are derived, and the roots of Homo sapiens lie not in a single African cradle, but in the long, complex evolutionary history of the Mediterranean world. Thanks for watching.